Chapter 12. The Enduring Psalter. Soli Deo Gloria. I will sing of the Lord's great love forever. With my mouth I will make your faithfulness known through all generations. Psalm 89:1, NIV. Mr. Pipes, swinging his walking stick and whistling, strode briskly along the winding pavement returning from the village. As he approached the farm, Annie and Drew came from the barn to meet him. Mr. Pipes's mouth twitched in amusement. Drew, wearing a one-legged milking stool strapped to his middle, looked for all the world like he'd sprouted a tail. "Good morning," called Annie, smiling at the way the morning sun glowed on Mr. Pipes's white hair. "Where have you been?" asked Drew. "I posted a letter to Dr. Dudley letting him in on our change of plans. Employing guarded language, of course. Wouldn't want our spy intercepting the mail. I informed him we would arrive in Geneva for Sunday worship at the Cathedral of St. Pierre, where Calvin preached, and from there, England." "Do we have to leave?" asked Annie. "I mean, I know we do, but so soon?" "We have several more days," replied Mr. Pipes, "and a lifetime of fond memories for you and the Charroux children. I'm certain of that." "So," said Drew, "do we take the train to Geneva?" "Ah, that is where you are wrong," said Mr. Pipes, tapping his stick on the gravel for emphasis. "I made telephone inquiries whilst in the village this morning, and have hired a wonderful sailing craft for our transport to Geneva. You know it is just down the lake from here." "Surrounded by mountains and sparkling like jewels," said Annie. "That will be a voyage to remember." "Indeed it will be, my dear," said Mr. Pipes. "Boat like Toplady?" asked Drew. "Oh, larger still," said Mr. Pipes, "with accommodations. A wee cabin, you know." "We'll sleep in it?" asked Annie. "And eat?" added Drew. Yes, all of that," said Mr. Pipes with a laugh, "while moored snugly at the pier in Geneva." For 3 more days, Annie and Drew's life on the Charroux farm was filled with work and play. Drew helped Monsieur Charroux, Pierre, and Francois with the milking, delivering the milk twice daily to the village La Tarie in the cart pulled by Bruno. Between milking, he and the boys hefted great bales of hay onto a flatbed cart pulled by the bright blue farm tractor. Monsieur Charroux even let Drew drive, but only in the pasture. Each afternoon the boys and Rinky-Dink played in the woods and fished in the pond. When Annie and Paulette were not busy making paper dolls, they helped Dame Charroux and kindly Madame Charroux harvest tomatoes and cucumbers in the garden. They chopped and visited together, preparing meals for the hungry family. When they finished feeding the calves, Annie and Dame Charroux arranged flowers for the dinner table. Though Annie understood very little of what Dame Charroux said, she learned French words by pointing at an object or holding up a flower. Dame Charroux would reply with a dignified smile and a sideways nod of her head, "Les fleurs." One morning, Annie found Dame Charroux alone at her table reading her French Bible. She motioned for Annie to join her. Annie ran quickly upstairs and retrieved her own Bible, and for the next hour Dame Charroux read favorite passages from the sacred pages. Annie followed along in English, her heart growing more in love with the saintly old woman and with her God. And they sang psalms, at morning milking, after breakfast, while doing evening chores, and all together again at evening worship. When Annie and Drew asked Mr. Pipes about the non-stop singing, he replied, "In James's epistle we read, 'Is any merry? Let him sing psalms.' This is a joyful Christian family, children, and their joy overflows, as it ought to, in praise." Many kisses were planted on many wet cheeks Saturday morning when it came time to leave. Annie hugged little Henry, and then, not trusting herself to speak, she kissed Lady Kitty and placed her into the pudgy arms of her new master. She felt a sob choking her as she hugged Dame Charroux and said, "Au revoir, until we meet again." But would they? She could only hope. Drew thrust Rinky-Dink into Francois's hand as he said goodbye. "He's a German frog, but if you'll teach him French, he should get along fine with Swiss frogs. He'll pick up French really fast." "Adieu. God be with you," called the family, waving as Mr. Pipes and Annie and Drew walked away from the farm toward the train. Biting her lip, Annie turned for one last look. "Woof, woof," Bruno called after them. An hour later they stood on the dock at Lausanne, looking at the boat Mr. Pipes had hired. "She's a beauty," said Annie, cupping her hands around her face as she peered through a bronze porthole. "Oh, and it's like a dollhouse inside." "She looks a seaworthy craft," said Mr. Pipes, striding the length of the vessel with his hands clasped behind his back like an admiral. "Will it sail faster than Toplady?" asked Drew, squinting up at the varnished mast rising high above the deck, "being bigger and all?" "I should think so," said Mr. Pipes, swinging his leg over the lifeline. "Give me your hand, Annie dear." "What's her name?" asked Annie. She ran her hand over the rich wood grain of the teak doors leading below. "Can I go below?" "Minstrel," said Mr. Pipes. "Lovely name for a boat moved by the winds. And you most certainly may go below. Make yourself at home." "Shall I cast her off, skipper, sir?" asked Drew. "Lend a hand unfurling the mainsail first," said Mr. Pipes, "and then heave on the main halyard. Weave a lovely easterly." Moments later, after the frantic rattling and flapping of sails, Mr. Pipes gave the signal. Drew cast off and jumped aboard. Mr. Pipes sheeted in the main. The sails snapped taut and billowed to port. Mr. Pipes eased the sheet. The dock hand waved and called, "Bon voyage!" Annie felt a thrill as Minstrel leapt to life, leaving the dock behind and moving swiftly onto the wide, sparkling lake. "We're sailing!" Drew yelled from the bow where he worked, arm over arm, raising the jib halyard. As he pulled, he watched the sail climb higher, flapping in the gathering breeze. "Annie, mind the tiller," said Mr. Pipes, wrapping the jib sheet on the wench and pulling on it. He leaned over the lifeline, squinting critically at the foresail, until with a nod of satisfaction he cleated off the sheet and took the tiller from Annie. "Thank you, my dear," he said, glancing at the bubble-like compass and easing the tiller to starboard. "Now we're really sailing," said Drew, joining them in the cockpit of the sturdy craft. "Indeed," agreed Mr. Pipes. Annie, her hair fluttering in the breeze, gazed at the sunlight shimmering like gold on the patchwork vineyards along the steep shoreline. She turned and watched the jagged mountains rising above the lake on the French side. She listened to the chuckling of the water against Minstrel's planked sides, and leaned back against the warm wood of the cockpit combing and breathed a contented sigh. "Lovely, isn't it, my dear?" said Mr. Pipes, smiling at her. Minstrel heeled slightly. The winch rattled as he eased the sheet, and the boat raced along like a hunting pony eager for the chase. The wind could not be more perfect for a day on Lake Geneva. Lac Léman, the French call it, he added. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they saw more sailboats, their owners enjoying the warm summer day and perfect winds on the deep blue lake. "Hey, look at that red sail," said Annie. "It almost looks like a giant balloon. Well, half a balloon." For a fleeting moment she wondered if the spy might be on one of those boats. "That's a spinnaker," said Mr. Pipes. "Wonderfully powerful downwind sail." "It's got a white cross right in the middle," said Drew. "Swiss flag," said Mr. Pipes. "Fancy that, a sail made to look like their national flag." "Isn't it about lunchtime?" asked Drew a few minutes later. "If you think it is, my boy," said Mr. Pipes with a laugh. "I seldom feel the need to consult my watch for mealtimes, Drew, when you are near." Annie went below and unwrapped the lunch Madame Chahut packed for their voyage. They munched on Swiss cheese sandwiches made with Dame Chahut's hearty wheat bread smothered in sweet cream butter, raisins grown along the slopes of the lake, sweet yellow pears, juicy and ripe, and washed it all down with bubbly mineral water. "Aren't the Swiss known for chocolate?" asked Drew after devouring his second sandwich. "Some of the finest chocolate in the world, most assuredly," said Mr. Pipes. "Just curious," said Drew, now seated at the tiller and gazing nonchalantly up at the trim of the mainsail as he'd seen Mr. Pipes doing. "And I happen to have stumbled upon several rather large slabs of the delicacy," said Mr. Pipes, with a merry twinkle in his eyes. "The other day in the village, now whatever did I do with it?" He rustled in his pockets, then in his knapsack, feigning a futile search. "Aha! Here we are. Saved it for just such a time as this." "If you insist," said Drew, laughing as he broke off a chunk and began chewing the rich, creamy Swiss chocolate. After several hours, the lake seemed to grow narrower, the steepness on the Swiss side growing more gentle. "I think we might be getting close to the end of this huge lake," said Annie, gazing forward. "And I'm pretty sure that looks like a bigger city than anything we've seen so far." Mr. Pipes consulted the chart. "Indeed, it is Geneva just ahead." "What on earth is that giant column of water doing shooting up in the air like that?" asked Drew as they sailed even closer to the city. "Do they have whales in this lake?" "It's a big one if they do." No, no, my boy, laughed Mr. Pipes. It is the Gite d'eau. Genevans converted a former outlet of the city's waterworks into an artificial geyser continuously shooting water hundreds of feet into the sky. A Geneva landmark, one might call it. I'll try avoiding it, said Drew, the mist from the waterspout drifting onto his face. But, where do I go? Do you see that jetty projecting out into the lake? Asked Mr. Pipes. Just over there, with that lovely lighthouse beacon. He pointed to the right of the waterspout. Drew eased the tiller to port as they came up alongside an imposing stone promenade. Couples strode arm in arm, children raced each other along the waterfront walk, and Annie smiled, watching a dog take its master for a walk. Mr. Pipes, said Drew, looking uneasy at the confusing rows of docks and narrow slips filled with a forest of tall masts, I think you better take it from here. Very well, my boy. You trot forward and lower the mainsail. One doesn't want too much speed when approaching a mooring under sail. The boat slowed as Drew dropped the mainsail. With Mr. Pipes's guidance, he gathered it in pleats on the boom and lashed it with sail ties. Now, move to the bow, and with the dock line in hand, prepare to step off when I bring us alongside the guest moorage just ahead. We'll tie on the port side. Annie held her breath. She finally decided to tidy up down below. Mr. Pipes eased the jib sheet. The sail went slack, and Minstrel drifted soundlessly toward the dock. In a calm voice, Mr. Pipes said, There, now step ashore and cleat us off, my boy. Minstrel nudged gently against the dock. Mr. Pipes stepped off and made fast the stern line. In a flurry of activity, they stowed sails and tidied ship. What next? Asked Annie when they'd finished. Shore leave, said Mr. Pipes, gathering his walking stick, and a visit to the grand cathedral in which John Calvin preached 500 years ago. She has a lovely organ, he added, a little wistfully, as they made their way onto the promenade. Afternoon rush hour found Geneva's streets busy with traffic and her sidewalks crowded, but far from chaotic. Geneva, though clearly a very busy place, was an orderly city. Annie, nevertheless, clung to Mr. Pipes's hand as they crossed traffic and made their way into the narrow, winding streets of the old city. She studied every face. Would the spy find them in Geneva? The old part of town seemed deserted after the bustle of the business district, and as they wound their way up a cobbled street, Annie eased her grip on Mr. Pipes's hand. Moments later, a narrow spire rising high above them flicked into view through a gap in the stone houses lining the street. And then they rounded a wide corner and saw before them the twin Gothic towers and thin brass spire of St. Pierre. The Swiss flag flapped lazily from the south tower. Ah, here it is, said Mr. Pipes, leading them through the arched entrance. Much more impressive from inside, isn't it? He said in hushed tones as they looked down the high vaulted nave. A shaft of light shone from the upper row of Gothic stained glass windows and cast a flood of light on the curving stairway leading to an ornately carved pulpit. Just there, he pointed to the pulpit, as they walked down the central aisle, their steps echoing softly off the high stone walls and ceiling. Calvin preached in this very place, and sometimes every day of the week. Why so much preaching? Asked Drew. Calvin answered that best himself, replied Mr. Pipes. He said that biblical preaching is the soul of the church. It is God stretching his hands out to us. He even called preaching the visitation of God. Pretty important, then, said Annie, running her fingers over the curved wood of the banister leading to the high pulpit. And when they gathered here to hear Calvin preach God's word, said Annie, they sang psalms, didn't they? She looked around at the empty pews and imagined them filled with families like the Charus, lifting their voices in psalms of praise to God right in these walls. They most certainly did, said Mr. Pipes. He said singing psalms and worship brings us into the company of angels. Just then, Drew thought he heard wings flapping high overhead in the cathedral. What was that? He said, gazing up at the ribbed vaulting. Sparrows, I fear, or swallows, said Mr. Pipes. And there they are. Dipping and swooping, several sparrows circled the large central chandelier and landed in a row on the back of one of the pews. Do you think we can catch one? Hissed Drew, inching toward the pew. Mr. Pipes smiled and said, Never, but I am reminded of Psalm 84. No doubt the psalmist experienced something very like this, only in the temple. It reads, How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth for the courts of the Lord. Yea, the sparrow hath found an house, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young, even thine altars. The sparrows twittered merrily on their perch. Suddenly the birds stopped singing, and in a flurry of wings they flittered upward, disappearing under the Gothic arches. Then, with a wild yell, an old man holding a broom high over his bald head came running down the aisle, his eyes bulging from his red face. Allez-vous, allez-vous, he screamed, swinging the broom in frustration as the birds flew to safety. He wiped his balding forehead, and seeing his unexpected guest, said, "Ah, c'est terriblement, c'est sacrilege." Mr. Pipes spoke briefly with the man, who then, scowling upward and with a shake of his fist at the feathered intruders, turned and swept his way down the aisle, disappearing up a circular staircase in the north transept. "I take it he doesn't appreciate Psalm 84, said Drew. "At least not the part about the birds." "I think they're nice," said Annie, "and I'll bet sparrows flew around in here when Calvin preached. Tell us more about him. I think you left off when he and his wife Idelette returned to Geneva. When was it?" 1541, said Drew. "Precisely," said Mr. Pipes. "Calvin stepped into that pulpit after his 3 years of banishment, and everyone wondered on what text he would preach. Would he rail against the mob who drove him out, but now found themselves begging him to return?" "Yeah!" said Drew, slamming his fist into his palm with a sharp slap that echoed through the nave. I don't think so," said Annie, sitting down on the bottom step of the curved stairway leading to the pulpit. "But what did he preach on?" "Calvin opened his Bible," said Mr. Pipes, settling into a nearby pew, and turned to the exact text where he left off 3 years before, and expounded God's word without mention of past wrongs. "He could have nailed him," said Drew. "Yes, but Calvin's sole concern was the glory of God in all of life. For the next 25 years, Calvin preached, taught, and wrote commentaries and letters encouraging and instructing saints all over Europe. Under Calvin's wise and godly leadership, Geneva soon became a refuge for Christians fleeing persecution. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, called Geneva the most perfect school of Christ since the days of the apostles. And French Huguenots came to study at Calvin's knee in the Academia, now the University of Geneva, and then returned to France as missionaries, many to die martyrs' deaths for loyalty to Christ. Did all those refugees learn psalm singing in Geneva?" asked Drew. "Indeed, they did," said Mr. Pipes. Among the English and Scottish refugees fleeing the persecutions of Bloody Mary was a young man named William Keith. He and others began translating and versifying the Psalms in English. When they returned to Britain, they sang many of them to the Geneva jigs, as critics like to call Calvin's congregational singing. Psalm 100 is one of Keith's psalm versifications sung to Louis Bourgeois's tune, Old 100th. Anglicans, Scottish Presbyterians, and American Puritans sang only the Psalter for generations. Calvin's Geneva Psalter was the model of their singing. "We sang Old 100th at the farm," said Drew. "Old doesn't mean out of date and useless, does it?" he added. "No, indeed, my boy. Old, when applied to a great hymn or psalm, means a treasure, a lasting treasure. You see, the worth of what we sing in worship is not based on age. Worth is determined by what is true and beautiful." "I think I understand what you mean," said Annie. "Could you teach us one of Calvin's psalms?" she went on, "one that is versified?" "That poses a bit of a problem, my dears. For you see, Calvin's battle cry was, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone the glory. In that spirit, Calvin didn't sign any psalms and hymns he might have written. However, some ascribe to Calvin a hymn that appeared in the Strasbourg Psalter. No one knows for sure if he wrote it, but it certainly is in keeping with his reverence for God, and he was in Strasbourg encouraging congregational singing when it first appeared. He pulled out his hymnal. "Here it is, my dears," he said, pressing back the pages with his fingers. "It rather reminds me of Luther's A Mighty Fortress, but this is less martial, with a touch of sweetness and near perfect gentleness, qualities that critics of Calvin would never ascribe to him." His clear voice rang off the walls as he read, "I greet thee, who my sure Redeemer art, my only trust and Saviour of my heart, who pain didst undergo for my poor sake. I pray thee from our hearts all cares to take. Thou art the King of mercy and of grace, reigning omnipotent in every place. So come, O King, and our whole being sway, shine on us with the light of thy pure day. Thou art the life by which alone we live, and all our substance and our strength receive. O comfort us in death's approaching hour, strong-hearted then to face it by thy power. Thou hast the true and perfect gentleness, no harshness hast thou and no bitterness. Make us to taste the sweet grace found in thee, and ever stay in thy sweet unity. Our hope is in no other save in thee, our faith is built upon thy promise free. O grant to us such stronger hope and sure, that we can boldly conquer and endure. Out of the stillness when he finished reading, Annie said, if it was Calvin, he was a better poet than he admitted. She looked over Mr. Pipes's shoulder at the words. I love the way he organized each verse. How is that, my dear? Asked Mr. Pipes, smiling at her. Drew came over for a look. Well, in each verse he makes a statement. Her eyes ran down the page. A statement about God or our relationship with God. Hey, you're right, said Drew. He's our Savior, King, our life. And he has true and perfect gentleness, and sweet grace is found in him, said Annie. And thus, added Mr. Pipes, our faith and hope rests in God alone. And the second part of each verse, Annie continued, is a prayer for something. Well observed, my dears, Mr. Pipes beamed at them. You see, this hymn follows the biblical model of adoration and worship. The theological truth must come first, then the prayer of faith to God who, by his sweet grace, makes us to boldly conquer and endure. Calvin understood the essential importance of theology. He was even called the theologian of the Reformation, and through his writing and the Psalter, biblical Christianity flourished and spread the world over. Mr. Pipes rose, and the children followed him out of the cathedral and down the steps. I have one more thing to show you before we retire to minstrel for the night. Tomorrow we shall come back here and worship. He paused on the steps, looking back at the Gothic facade of the church. Here, where Calvin preached, and where Christians have sung psalms and hymns for centuries. As if on cue, the bells from the tower of the cathedral suddenly began a slow gonging, echoing down the winding streets. Wait! It sounds like a tune, said Drew, listening. Hey! It is! It's a mighty fortress, Luther's hymn, here in Geneva. The bells of St. Pierre are tuned to Ein Fils de Dieu, Luther's grand melody, because it is the battle hymn of the entire Reformation, Lutheran or Calvinist. They listened until the weighty music ended. Maybe we'll sing Luther's hymn in church tomorrow, said Drew. Maybe we'll sing Calvin's hymn, said Annie. 'Twould be lovely, said Mr. Pipes. After several minutes walking along the bumpy cobblestones of the streets, Drew suddenly stopped. Rue Jean Calvin, he read from the street sign. Wasn't that the street we left our boat on in Strasbourg? Indeed it was, said Mr. Pipes. Remember, Calvin left his influence there as well. And just ahead I'll show you a monument to his worldwide influence. A wide grassy park, nearly as long as a football field, spread along paving stones. Rising above these stones, 4 bearded figures, all carved out of solid rock, stood in long flowing robes. They're giants, said Annie. Drew moved closer and read, Calvin, Farel, Beza, and Knox. He frowned up at the statues. Who was Beza? Ah, a most important fellow, replied Mr. Pipes. He was an accomplished poet and theologian who joined Calvin in preaching the gospel. After Calvin's death in 1564, Beza became the pastor of the Genevan church, his successor at St. Pierre. A poet? Said Annie. Yes, said Mr. Pipes. The great poet Marot died without completing the Psalter, leaving Calvin with only 49 psalms in French when he returned to Geneva. Beza, preaching in Lausanne in 1551, added 34 more psalms to Marot's. In his introduction, a poetic classic in its own right, Beza called for poets, those with minds of heavenly birth, to turn their pens to spiritual themes, to write enduring verse with which all the church might worship God. Later, when persecution of French Christians grew worse, Beza's poetic way with words is seen in bold lines written to the French king. The church of God is indeed an avail to receive and not strike blows, but an anvil that has worn out many hammers. Drew walked over and touched the warm granite of one of Beza's giant feet. Next to Beza, he looked up at Calvin, rising a dozen feet or more above. They were giants, he said simply. Spreading in both directions of this statue, continued Mr. Pipes, one sees the influence of Calvinism in England, Scotland, Holland, and in your America, just here. Drew followed Mr. Pipes to the right and read, "We do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God, and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, Anno Domini 1620. "That's the Mayflower Compact," said Annie. "We learned that in school." "Not only did Calvin formulate and restore biblical theology," said Mr. Pipes, "his reforms here in Geneva have affected politics, even as far away as America. You must read more about him. But now we must buy what food we shall require on the Lord's day and retire to our ship." Annie wriggled in excitement. It was the first time she and Drew had ever slept in a boat. She ran her fingers over the finely fitted rows of polished teak lining her berth. Leaning on her elbow, she peered out the porthole at the twinkling lights of the harbor shimmering on the dark water. Nearby, Drew listened to the soft lapping of Lake Geneva against Minstrel's hull. The boat rocked gently. "Good night, my dears," whispered Mr. Pipes a few moments later from his berth in the forecastle. There was no reply. "What do the Swiss call these?" asked Drew the next morning, staring hungrily at a plate of large buns hollowed out and filled with whipped cream. "Gugelhup, popular all over Switzerland," replied Mr. Pipes. "Gugelhup? What a name!" said Annie after they gave thanks. She bit into the sweet pastry. Gulp. "Is there enough for seconds?" asked Drew. "Indeed! Finished already?" said Mr. Pipes from across the ship's dining table. "My lad, don't bolt your food. One must chew." I do, however, want to arrive plenty early for worship." After they cleared up their breakfast dishes, Mr. Pipes watched Drew's awkward attempts at tying his necktie. "Allow me, Drew," said Mr. Pipes, untangling the wadded tie and knotting it smartly. The nave of the great cathedral was nearly empty when the threesome arrived 40 minutes early for worship. "There's the bird hater," said Drew, pointing to the little red-faced man who stood wringing his hands in the narthex of the cathedral. "Looks pretty upset about something," said Annie. "Let's find out what troubles him," said Mr. Pipes. As Mr. Pipes talked in French with the agitated man, the children watched his face and tried to figure out the problem. Mr. Pipes first looked sympathetic, then puzzled, then he shook his head as if dismissing something out of hand, then a faraway twinkle came to his eyes. He broke into a smile, nodded his head in agreement. The little man suddenly grabbed Mr. Pipes by the shoulders and planted a kiss on each cheek. Turning to the children, Mr. Pipes said, "Well, that's settled then. Follow us." Annie and Drew scurried to keep up with the Birdman and Mr. Pipes. Puzzled, they mounted a staircase winding up a narrow stone shaft. It reminded Drew of Coburg Castle, where they spent the night in Luther's room. Suddenly, they stepped out onto a narrow gallery, the nave of the cathedral sprawling far below. As the children admired the view, the Birdman led Mr. Pipes to the organ console. Drew turned and saw rank upon rank of pipes rising above the keyboard. "What's going on?" asked Drew. "Monsieur Bellieur needs an organist," Mr. Pipes explained. "The organist of the cathedral is très malade, unwell, sick. That is to say, he cannot play for morning worship." "And you'll do it, won't you, Mr. Pipes?" said Annie. "I have consented to fill in," said Mr. Pipes, positioning his glasses on his nose and sitting at the organ console. He shifted the bench, then began pulling stops and stretching his arms and feet out, getting a feel for the instrument. "Monsieur Bellieur has asked us, to select the psalms and hymns for worship. It is truly the minister's task, but he insists that we must do it. What would you two suggest?" Annie and Drew began listing a torrent of favorite hymns. Mr. Pipes lifted his hands. Hold, my dears. The liturgy includes but 4 hymns. May I suggest we begin with a German hymn, then 2 French, and conclude with, again, a German hymn. How does that sound?" After much discussion, they finally agreed on 4 hymns. Mr. Pipes played a quiet prelude blending the melodies of all 4. The children stayed up in the gallery by the organ, peering over the rail at the service below when not singing. "This is what I call a bird's eye view," Drew whispered in Annie's ear. They sang along in English, using Mr. Pipes' hymnal. "All praise to God who reigns above. The Lord forsaketh not his flock, his chosen generation. He is their refuge and their rock, their peace and their salvation." After a corporate confession of their sins, they sang Psalm 68 to the rousing tune, greater. God shall arise and by his might put all his enemies to flight. Then in French, the minister, wearing a plain black gown with white collar, led the congregation in reading Exodus 20. After several more minutes passed, the congregation rose and sang, I greet thee, who my sure Redeemer art. Thou art the King of mercy and of grace, reigning omnipotent in every place. Make us to taste the sweet grace found in thee. Our faith is built upon thy promise free. The minister preached a sermon during which Mr. Pipes, his face moving from earnest consent to brow-furrowing sadness and even alarm, whispered occasional translations. Then came the final hymn. The organ swelled with the manly tune of Ein Festebüch. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. We're not the right man on our side. The man of God's own choosing. Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabbath, his name. From age to age the same. God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. Annie and Drew wanted it never to end. The minister pronounced the benediction. When the service ended, Mr. Pipes clicked at switches and stops, putting things in order at the organ console. Grandeur, my dears, grandeur, he said, plunking the last stop in place. And it is all ours, from age to age and throughout all eternity. This grandeur is yours. Monsieur Balayeur pumped Mr. Pipes' hand and introduced him to the minister, who expressed his gratitude for Mr. Pipes' organ playing. As they walked down the steps of the cathedral, a tall gentleman with a mustache and black leather medical case firmly in hand stopped them. Well, now, if I may make so bold, I say, dashed awfully good to see you. Looking tolerably. I say, may I take your blood pressure? 'Twill only take a moment. Dr. Dudley himself, said Mr. Pipes, wringing his friend's hand. But Martin, whatever are you doing here? Hang my blood pressure. Oh, do greet the children. Hello, he said, turning briefly to Annie and Drew. Shall we say, he continued to Mr. Pipes, let's just say that my communication with you was somewhat interrupted. When I received your letter, at last, I felt very much the need to determine for myself if you were still, well, alive. Absolutely dropped off the planet you did, sir. Martin, as so frequently happens in my conversation with you, I don't have the slightest idea what you are talking about. Suddenly, Annie's fingernails dug into Drew's arm and she hissed in his ear, It's him, coming up the steps, toward us. She cowered behind her brother. Drew tried to be brave. Maybe this was it. The showdown. The spy had finally cornered his prey and... Drew tugged on Mr. Pipes' sleeve viciously. The spy strode up and stopped abruptly next to Dr. Dudley. Drew swallowed hard. He watched the spy's hands. If he reaches inside his jacket, I'll... Catching sight of the man, recognition quickly spread across Mr. Pipes' face. He fixed his eyes steadily on the spy and positioned himself in front of the children, his arms spread, protecting them as best he could. Ah, yes, said Dr. Dudley. My nephew Brentwood, just returning from making my call to the Geneva police. You see, when I didn't find you in church this morning, by the by, where were you? Never mind. When you didn't show for services, I made my decision and put an all-points bulletin out on you as a missing person. The children, too, of course. There will be notices all over the city by nightfall. No doubt the next round of milk cartons will feature your pictures. 'Tis dashed inconvenient now I've found you. I do hope you're not disappointed with the photographs I've chosen. He is your nephew? Said Annie. Brentwood's the name, said the spy, extending his hand and smiling warmly. Mr. Pipes just stared. When he did find his voice, he said, Martin, your care of me is boundless, and, I fear, forgive me for saying so, somewhat mindless at times. I beg your pardon, sir, said Dr. Dudley. Your nephew can fill you in on all the hazards we underwent trying desperately to evade your surveillance, believing him to be... It suddenly seemed all rather silly to Mr. Pipes, and he hesitated before admitting, believing him to be, well, to be a spy. A what? Said Dr. Dudley. My dear man, have you again taken entire leave of your senses? The need for my consent, oversight, my dear fellow, is now more clearly established than ever. A spy? I say, did these little blighters put such a notion in your hoary head? Annie cowered behind Mr. Pipes. My dear Martin, I assure you that you have been with us, tracked and hounded as we were by by your kindness, you would have concluded very much the same about our situation." "I thought it was great," Drew chimed in. "We jumped ship, ducked in and out of back streets at breakneck speed, even climbed out a window on a rope made of bed sheets. Sure, it was a little dangerous, but what a lot of fun you made for us, Dr. Dudley. Thanks." "What? I never," Dr. Dudley sputtered. Annie squinted, looking closely at Brentwood's face. "So I am glad to see you didn't actually pierce your nose," she said. "Must have been a clip-on. Oh, and hair grows back, you know. But how can I ever thank you for catching Lady Kitty like you did?" "Yeah, that was some catch," said Drew. "How'd you do it?" "Oh, that. I play a bit of rugby at Oxford," said Brentwood modestly. "You must do a bit of swimming, too," said Mr. Pipes. "Swimming to shore in Rhine River current as you did? Wise of you to leave behind the combat boots and leather jacket." Brentwood just smiled. "I needed work for the summer holidays. Uncle Martin enlisted my help. It was all very fun. In fact, when is your next adventure?" "Oh, no," said Dr. Dudley decisively. "Clearly, I will need to be personally in charge of future surveillance of my most incorrigible patient. Why did not I go into veterinary surgery? Now then, I propose we get out of Geneva before your pictures are posted everywhere. But first, my dear man, how about that blood pressure?"